Regions and geography. There are 4 regions in British Columbia. The northern interior covers a large part of BC, and its environment is similar to most of northern Canada. The coast is a wet, mild climate influenced by the Pacific Ocean. The annual rainfall in some areas is over 400 centimeters a year. The northeast is separated from the rest of BC by the Rocky Mountains. It's composed of 3 different overlapping landscapes: the foothills of the Rockies, Muskeg of the north, and the prairies of the east. The southern interior covers a large part of BC with a network of rivers and lakes. The interior is the hottest and driest region of BC. Traditional resource gathering. Most plants are harvested by hand or with simple tools. Berries were picked and placed in woven baskets. Root vegetables were collected with digging sticks. Sometimes the First Nations used controlled burning to maintain their fields. Sometimes trees were cut down with adze. First Nations also used bark from trees, harvesting it in long strips. Harvesting plants involved a spiritual element, with many groups celebrating the first berry of the year. Many skills were necessary to catch salmon in rivers or the ocean. In the ocean, they used trolling hooks or nets, often using beach scenes. Stone traps, ice fishing, spears, gill nets, and weirs were also used.
Hunting. Moose, caribou, and deer were main sources of meat for interior people. Hunting required highly developed tracking skills, as well as knowledge of various territories where the animals traveled. They needed to understand animal behavior so they could attract with sounds. Sometimes individuals hunting with bow and arrows, more often people worked together to hunt whole herds. Fences or corrals were also used. Deadfalls were used to trap game.
Traditional economy. First Nations were the most active and expert traders at the time in North America. The wealth of salmon allowed many tribes to participate in the trade. Cedar canoes were an important trade item for coastal people, and people with access to lots of salmon had advantage in the trade. Oolican grease was a very important trade item. It was so important that trading routes were called grease trails. These trails were well maintained and 2 meters wide. People traded status goods such as dentalium, coppers, and obsidian. Other goods such as Indian hemp, furs, camas ball, soapberries, fish, and blankets were also traded. The potlatch. The word potlatch means to give. Potlatches are held in the winter. Potlatches are an important part in the social, political, economic, and spiritual aspects of the First Nations people. The host of a potlatch distributes his wealth to all invited. The potlatch functions as a bank, life insurance, and pension fund. There are dances, oral histories, and songs at potlatches. The host gives away items such as food, tools, blankets, and valuable items. The guests accept the stories and events of the host. First European contact. When Captain Cook first made contact with the First Nations, it was the start of the era of the fur trade. Hundreds of ships with newcomers and traders came to BC. When the people made contact, the Europeans brought diseases that devastated the First Nations. Europeans also brought guns, which the First Nations had never seen before. Colonialism. With the discovery of gold in BC, tens of thousands of newcomers came looking for a fortune. The colony of Vancouver Island was created in 1849 and joined together with BC in 1864. James Douglas abandoned treaties in favor of Indian reserves. Douglas's successor, Joseph Trutch, denied that First Nations had Aboriginal title and limited reserves to 10 acres per family. Gunboat justice was used to keep order along the coast during the 1800s. Canada takes control. First Nations adults were legally children, and the federal government assumed responsibility over them. The province of BC had control over the Crown lands. BC's refusal to recognize Aboriginal rights has led to land claim issues. In 1876, the Indian Act was passed. It took control of many aspects of First Nations' daily lives. The government tried to assimilate the First Nations. First Nations children were sent to residential schools where they were treated very poorly. Many of the cultural practices of the First Nations were banned while the government tried to assimilate them. First Nations blocking the way of miners and Mounties in protest led to the signing of Treaty 8 in 1899. Organizing for Aboriginal rights. In World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, a significant number of First Nations fought for Canada. The McKenna-McBride Commission was held to get rid of the Indian problem. Its task was to visit each First Nations community in BC to consult the amount of land they required. In response to the McKenna-McBride Commission, the Allied Indian Tribes was formed. A new amendment to the Indian Act was passed in 1929, which made it criminal to try to achieve recognition of Aboriginal title, so no land claims. This led to the criminalization of the potlatch. Seized items from the potlatch were sold to collectors or put in museums, with the Native Brotherhood emerging in the 1930s. By the 1940s, First Nations were able to vote, get pensions, and go to public school. Also, the anti-potlatch law was repealed. Epidemics. Europeans brought many goods for trade, some of which had germs that caused sickness for the First Nations. The Europeans brought diseases and wiped out 90% of the First Nations. The most devastating was the smallpox epidemic. Legal battles and victories. The Calder case of 1969 was named after a young Nisga'a leader, Frank Calder. The case was about Aboriginal title of the Nisga'a people of the Nass Valley. In 1973, the Supreme Court agreed that the Nisga'a held title to the land before colonialism, but couldn't agree about after colonialism. The important result was that the federal government refocused its look on land claims. By 1980, it was apparent Canada would gain control of its own constitution. The Native people realized they went on the Constitution Express, which was a train ride across Canada. The Constitution was created in 1982, and the Aboriginals were recognized in three groups: Métis, Indians, and Inuit. The Oka crisis of 1990 involved a golf course being built on Mohawk burial grounds. The Mohawks put up roadblocks, and the RCMP attacked and gunfire ensued. The roadblock lasted 78 days and got international media. Self-government. The Sechelt Indian Band was the first band to achieve self-governance. One way to achieve self-governance was to negotiate treaties. Most of the First Nations did this through the BC Treaty Commission, which was a very slow process. Self-government needed communities to have a solid economic base. There are three types of self-government: nation government, community of interest, and public government.